All aboard! This is Phil Bell, your highly trained rail enthusiast, back here with you from the E. Hunter Harrison Chair for Advanced Railroad Studies, and coming to you, as always, from behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. So I want to start by thanking you for all of the enthusiasm that you shared for our Erie Lackawanna episode number 6. So, I love the Erie Lackawanna. You've heard me talk about it ad nauseum. And it's just so great to see so many people who really love that railroad. And it's very interesting to me because on one hand, we have talked about as rail enthusiasts all the things that we love about it. We love the paint scheme. We love the time it operated. We love the way that it was so scrappy and doing everything it could to compete in an environment that was so incredibly difficult. But then at the same time, of course, from a business side, and putting my hat on as someone who's worked in the rail industry and tried to start his own railroad, you look back and you say, well, it wasn't very good from a financial standpoint, although it did well in an operating standpoint. And so the outpouring of enthusiasm and the fact that so many of you have gone ahead and watched the video and in many cases even shared it with others, that's great. And I hope you will continue to do that. It's very important for us that you do, because as you know from any other YouTube or Spotify or Rumble or other podcasts that you listen to, the more that you share it and the more that you view it, the more that we are able to continue to provide the content. Because even if you're not making a contribution through our Patreon, which is linked below, even if you're not subscribing through our website, the more that you do this, the more that all of these services will go ahead and recognize that there is interest and they will share it with more people. Now, because of the enthusiasm that you showed for the Erie Lackawanna, which was one of the largest components of Conrail, I wanted to start by talking about today Conrail's formation. And Conrail, like many of the railroads of the latter day, and by the latter day, I'll say from the 1970s on, is a very, very complex entity. But it is so unique because it's made up of the components of so many railroads, and because unlike everything else you're going to see out there, it was explicitly not a continuation of what came before it. And that's not just because we look at it in 2023 and say, well, things were dramatically different after April Fool's Day 1976 than they were before. It's because even Conrail themselves went out of their way to say, look, we are not a continuation of all the railroads you knew. This is something completely different. And at the end of the day, it really did reflect that. Now, I want to talk about Conrail for another reason. It's because it's important to understand the context in which Conrail came about. That's important for every aspect of railroading, is to understand the context that it came about in and what led to it. And actually, you could really look at Conrail's genesis as starting in the 1930s. And I want to give you a good example here of the Old Colony Railroad. Now, the Old Colony Railroad, for those of you who don't know, is from a place that I like to call Taxachusetts. And you say, well, Phil, why are you, so down on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? Listen, I'm really not. I actually went to college up there, Boston University, live near Beacon Park Yard, so I had an opportunity to watch CSX, Amtrak, and the MBTA as they rolled through periodically. So it was a very good experience from that standpoint. Of course, we learned that Massachusetts was a lot like a lot of other states for many years, which is that it is a very high tax area, lots of regulations and so on. But as we go to railroading, I want to give you an example of the Old Colony in 1893. So you see the Old Colony Railroad, its furthest reaches were Fitchburg, Massachusetts. You have Lowell, Massachusetts. So Lowell is pretty substantial city there. Fitchburg, relatively small. Going south, you see Providence, Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, and then going out to Provincetown. And of course, most of the lines concentrated on Boston. Why am I bringing up the Old Colony? Well, because in the 1930s, the Old Colony was leased by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. And the New Haven, which deserves pretty much a week of episodes, was a good example of what railroading in the 1920s and 1930s was. See, the New Haven had been heavily manipulated by J.P. Morgan, the J.P. Morgan himself, and you could consider it J.P. Morgan's hometown railroad. His chief deputy, Charles Mellon, ran the railroad for him, and it wasn't just simply a railroad. It owned streetcar lines, it owned steamship lines. It was a truly integrated transportation enterprise in New England. Now, all this sounds to us as viewers in 2023 to be a really good thing. Why would you not want a completely integrated transportation system? After all, one of the most difficult things we face today in terms of either shipping or traveling by rail is the integration with other aspects, because, unless you're really lucky, the tracks don't come right up to your door or to your office. In my case, of course, they do. But you get the idea. So in general, whether you're talking about individuals or freight, there's usually some intermodal transportation, which is to say you switch from one mode to the other, and having everything under one roof should have worked incredibly well. The problem was it never really did. And part of the reason I want to go back to the map here to show you why is look at how much territory that the Old Colony itself, just one component of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, really covered. The reality is it's not that much. It's not that far from Boston to the tip of Cape Cod, where Provincetown is located. Fitchburg is not that far away. And when you look at all of these small communities there, many of them had, as we talked about with the Erie Lackawanna, different serving yards. So that meant you had people who were working them. You had people who were working the various trains. In the era of the steam locomotive, we certainly did not have simply a two-man crew, because you had an engineer, you had a fireman, and the fireman actually had to fire the locomotive. You had multiple brakemen. You had cabooses that would contain the conductor, who had a vast amount of paperwork to do. You had stations all over the place, which required station agents to work them, and so on. The railroad in the 1890s, 1893, as you see there, and on into the 1930s, was a place that was very labor intensive, in addition to being very work intensive, because it simply wasn't just, hey, look, we're going to get a few cars together and we'll take them from point A to point B and everything will be great. So this is what set the stage for Conrail, really, when the Old Colony helped to drag down the New York, New Haven, and Hartford. Now we're going to link in the description, to Wikipedia's article on the 88 stations case around Boston. And that is when, while the New Haven was in bankruptcy in the 1930s, they said, look, we just want to discontinue service to 88, actually more than 88 stations, because these are low ridership stations. Basically, people are not riding these trains, and there's relatively little actual freight traffic going on. And the subtext is, even though this isn't fully discussed in the article that you'll see there, that because there were so little actual traffic there, a lot of the handling that would take place was very expensive. So this was a big drag on the New Haven. And after J.P. Morgan himself had passed on, after Charles Mellon was no longer in the picture, after the carrier had gone bankrupt, it laid bare the fact that in order to have a very effective transportation infrastructure there and a good railroad, it wasn't going to be able to do things in this way. Now, comparing, as I mentioned, context, let's look at it in the late 90s, early 2000s. What did we learn? That first round of what happened with a lot of the dot-coms and some of the tech companies, we learned that the first few ideas about how you were to go about operating the internet weren't quite as profitable as had been forecast, and therefore a lot of those companies simply went bankrupt. They went away. We have all heard about Pets.com and how the Pets.com puppet survived Pets.com itself, and so the first attempt didn't work. The difference is, though, when it comes to railroads, we have very long-lived assets, whether it is the ownership of the railroad right-of-way or the easement that goes into controlling it, the tracks themselves, the locomotives, station buildings, and so on. These are things that simply don't just disappear the way that a rented office with a few servers and a few geeks, nothing against you geeks, but geeks that operate the tech companies. If tech company goes bankrupt, okay, those things go away. They go somewhere else and life goes on. But if a railroad, which had quickly woven itself into the transportation infrastructure, and as you could see here, again, with the Old Colony in 1893, all the commuter trains that were operating, the long distance trains that were operating over this, it was very much a part of everyday life in Massachusetts. So simply to say, well, it's not economical to do anymore, we're just going to end it, would have been a major negative impact. And that brings us to the second aspect of what led to Conrail, and that was the intrusiveness of the level of regulation. Now, as you'll see, going into the 88 stations case, part of the reason for this is because you have a judge that says, hey, look, these operations simply aren't profitable. We can't continue them. They have to end. That's the kind of thing that would happen in just about any bankruptcy case anywhere. But you had another entity involved called the Public Utilities Commission, in this case of Massachusetts. And what happened there? They said, whoa, hold on, wait a second. We have jurisdiction over the trains that operate in our Commonwealth, intrastate trains. Now, interstate trains were, of course, overseen by the Interstate Commerce Commission, and that was certainly another level of regulation that became far more intrusive and ridiculous. But the Public Utilities Commission looks over and says, hold on, if you guys stop operating those trains as you want to, and ultimately they did, for a time, then we are going to have a very difficult transportation problem in eastern Massachusetts. You can't do that. Ultimately, you had a court battle, and the PUC won. And so the Old Colony, and with the New Haven as being its operator, had to reinstate trains to a big chunk of this, which continued the money losing. Now, I want you to think about that in a different way. If you're not able to calibrate the services you provide or the price of the products that you offer to what the demand is, you as a business are automatically going to be losing. And in the 1930s, although it was still very nascent, the highway system in eastern Massachusetts and throughout the Northeast and New England was growing. And that meant there were more people, even if not the majority of people, who were able to avail themselves of both highways and trucking. And as we know from seeing railroads today in 2023, trucking is a very integral part of making final last mile deliveries of railroad freight. But at that time, it was much more competitive. And also, you had the Interstate Commerce Commission, who was then determined to make sure that railroads, which were still viewed as a robber baron controlled industry long after the robber barons were either dead, bankrupt, or both, they were hell-bent on making sure that railroads were not able to have any sort of influence beyond their rails. So that meant a lot of what we see today, where trucking is wholly integrated with rail and it's making last mile deliveries in addition to competing with rail. This was not something that was easy to do in those days. So that is one of the aspects that I wanted to talk about in the path to Conrail. The second I wanted to talk about comes to us from a state that I'm also very familiar with, and that is New Jersey. So giving you the map here of the Central Railroad of New Jersey. Now, as you can see, and this is a map from Trains Magazine, you can see some big similarities to what we saw with the Old Colony Railroad in Massachusetts. First of all, it is a relatively small service area. Although New Jersey, for those of us who are from there, feels like a very big place, because if you're like me and you're from North Jersey, you know how amazing it is. Then you have the people who unfortunately are from South Jersey, and we treat you like you don't exist. Just kidding. New Jersey in reality is a relatively small place. And so going back to what we talked about with the Erie Lackawanna, what does this map tell you? It tells you that the Jersey Central, just like what we saw with the Old Colony, has heavy commuter traffic, and both carriers also have a big time terminal system. And when I say terminal system, I mean they're doing a lot of receiving freight from other carriers. They're taking it a relatively short distance, and then they have to go through the process of taking it from a hub yard, such as the yards they had in the New York City area, just inside North Jersey, and taking it to a serving yard. And then from the serving yard, it would be taken the last mile to the customer's dock. This, as we've mentioned, is very expensive because each of those efforts requires a crew. And the crew in those days wasn't simply two guys. And as we have heard that a lot of railroads would like to try in 2023 and beyond, one man, this could be up to five, depending upon what the needs were and what the union agreements were. Another factor to remember, and this was particularly a problem for the Jersey Central, was the tax burden that was being imposed by the state of New Jersey. You heard with the Erie Lackawanna, in some cases, it could be 100% of full value was the tax assessment. And let's also remember, if you go to someplace like Liberty State Park today and you see the Jersey Central Terminal, which is still there, although all of the tracks are long gone, with the exception of some that are under the train shed, you get an idea of what the carrier had to contend with in terms of a tax burden just to provide what was at best a marginal service in terms of commuter trains. Because when you say, why are commuter trains a marginal service? Why are those so difficult? I ride the commuter trains. I love it. Well, there's several reasons. First of all, because, and this is changing a little bit, obviously, in the post-COVID era, but because of the fact that most people commute to work at one time and they commute out of work at another time, you need a substantial amount of equipment to provide that service. So you think about in the pre-COVID days when you would get on your commuter train going home and everything would be packed to the gills. If you were unlucky, you might have to stand. Well, all that equipment costs money for an investor-owned railroad. So that's number one. Number two, you need a lot of space to service that equipment. So again, if you go to Liberty State Park, you'll see a lot of area where there's just grass. Well, the reality is all that grass once had railroad tracks on it, and the majority of those railroad tracks were used to store passenger cars during the day while men, and it was mostly men in those days, were at work and until it was time for them to go home. So some railroads, and I know Erie Lackawanna's predecessors tried this, I'm sure the Jersey Central did as well, would try to stimulate additional traffic by promoting shopping in the midday, so that way some of this equipment that might be sitting idle at the terminals in Jersey City would go back out, get the wives, take them into the New York City area to shop, and then take them back home before returning back to get the men and bring them back to the suburbs. So that was certainly an idea, very entrepreneurial approach to it, but it also was not quite as effective. You still had these high fixed costs and relatively low revenues. Again, going back to the Public Utilities Commissions, in intrastate service, most often, if not always, that was regulated in terms of rates. Interstate service was regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission in terms of rates. So you have railroads that really can't win, and then at the same time, while you're trying to contend with this tax burden, you're also seeing the growth of highways, which are being subsidized by government, who at one point was a friend of the railroads in terms of getting them chartered, in terms of helping provide capital in some cases, in other cases being a big cheerleader and helping to facilitate capital infusion from private sector sources. Well, suddenly they turned around and said, you guys are robber barons. We don't like you very much. So therefore, we're going to start putting money into highways. And then as air travel became nascent, we're going to start to put money in that as well. And as I said, the Interstate Commerce Commission wanted to keep railroads as far away from these so-called infant industries as possible. Now, the other thing, going back to the tax burden for a second, I want you to take a look again back at the map. You see there's a lot of traffic, a lot of trackage west of Phillipsburg, New Jersey. You see Easton, Pennsylvania, Allentown, going up to Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and so on. All of that, despite being in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and not in the state of New Jersey, the state was also taxing the Jersey Central on the operations that took place in another state. So this is an example of what I know a lot of liberals love to do. And yes, I'm ragging on you liberals again on a railroad podcast, but they love the idea of a global tax system, which is wherever you are, you're going to have to pay tax on that income. So the Jersey Central said, you know what? You want to try that, New Jersey? Fine, we'll do something different. So they created the Central Railroad of Pennsylvania. You have the Central Railroad of New Jersey. They created the Central Railroad of Pennsylvania. And that idea was to put all of the trackage in Pennsylvania under a separate entity so that it would no longer be subject to New Jersey's absurd tax regime. And of course, what did the court say? Let's give the government everything they wanted. And so they ruled against the CRP. And ultimately, all this trackage came back under the umbrella of the Central Railroad of New Jersey, and the losses continued. The other thing to remember as you look back at the map one more time is it's a relatively light system that goes down to South Jersey. Part of this went to Atlantic City and was the route of the famous Blue Comet. A lot of this in the Winslow Junction area was carrying a lot of sand, and the sand traffic was profitable for the Jersey Central for a while, but it certainly would not have continued to be profitable. Now, today in time, the Winchester and Western and I do believe the Southern Railroad of New Jersey, they continue to have a little bit of the sand business, as well as Cape May Seashore Lines. It's nowhere what it once was, but a lot of this did help to sustain the southern end of that railroad for very many years. But the fact remains, it's a relatively small area that is being served both by the Jersey Central and by the Old Colony. Now, a lot of the other participants in this region, such as the Reading, and also the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, the Erie, they all suffered from the same problem. Relatively short distances of moving freight, substantial commuter operations that had high requirements for a short period of time, high taxes in order to support the service, and then regulated rates that prevented the railroad rates, and I should say service levels, that prevented the railroad from optimizing the service based on what the customers were seeking. And therefore, when you have that, you have a recipe for continued disaster. Now, what happened? In 1961, the New York, New Haven, and Hartford, after trying a whole heck of a lot of things, they managed to go bankrupt. And that was one of the early bankruptcies that foretold what would happen later. In 1967, the Jersey Central followed them off the cliff when they too went bankrupt. And now you had two major railroads in this region that were bankrupt, and there would soon be more. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is another participant, which is the Reading. The Reading actually controlled the Jersey Central, and both the Reading and the Jersey Central were in turn controlled by another railroad that really was never a consistent moneymaker, and many of you will be surprised at this, and that's the Baltimore and Ohio. Now, it's important to think about this again in context where you have the Jersey Central, the Reading, and the Baltimore and Ohio providing a trunk line that starts from the New York City area and goes to Chicago and St. Louis, but rather than like the Erie and the New York Central, which struck out through the state of New York before continuing west, this went down into Maryland, through Pennsylvania, Delaware, Pennsylvania, into Maryland, and Washington, D.C. before proceeding west. Now, of course, the Baltimore and Ohio has a couple of routes. The Old Main Line, which is CSX's Old Main Line subdivision, the original Baltimore and Ohio that does not go through Washington, D.C., but goes further to the north, and also the Metropolitan subdivision, which goes through Washington, D.C., right near Washington Union Station, but also takes trains to the west, eventually meeting up with the Old Main Line near Brunswick at Point of Rocks. So that you could consider to be one railroad, even if it wasn't all operated, under one name. So that's important. Therefore, when the Jersey Central was having financial trouble, when the Reading, which had a pretty substantial system in mostly eastern Pennsylvania, but also stretched down into Delaware and into New Jersey, although it had a good system and an interesting freight traffic base, it also had substantial amount of commuter services that operated into and around the Philadelphia area. A good friend of mine who works for the rail consultancy, he often puts it as the Reading was a transit company in many ways for the city of Philadelphia. So again, when you have relatively short hauls, you have high prices, and you have predatory taxing authorities, you have a recipe for bankruptcy. And then moving a little bit further southward to the Baltimore and Ohio. Now, the B&O, again, it deserves its own episode. A lot of its problems came from its capitalization, high debt that stayed with it for a very long time, and also the legacy of it being one of the, I guess you could say, financial marketplace playthings of a lot of the robber barons. And by the way, I want to be clear, I'm a free market guy. I have no problem with the robber barons. I actually thought they did a very good job in getting capital to flow into the railroad industry, even if they weren't always perfect about how they apportioned it. So don't take anything that I say about them as being an attack on their approach or what they did, because frankly, the name of the game in any business is to make money, and that includes railroading, and the robber barons did it very well, and were it not for them, we certainly would not have a railroad system that is as robustly developed as it is today. For all of the negatives that a lot of people like to say about it, it is one of the best railroad networks in the entire world, and it is the envy of every other country. It's not as large as India's, but it is the envy of every other country, even Japan, even China. They all wish they had our railroad network because we move freight better than anyone else. So that aside, the Baltimore and Ohio had a lot of problems from a financial standpoint that it never overcame until it was taken over in the 1960s by the Chesapeake in Ohio. And so that's where a lot of the money that ultimately flowed to the Jersey Central for items such as new GP40Ps and so on came from really the C&O and its coal revenue, as opposed to the Baltimore and Ohio, which was largely focused on both coal and also manufactured goods that came from the Northeast and the Midwest. So that gives you an idea of what some of the relationships were as it head toward Conrail, and also what some of the drivers were toward the bankruptcies. Now, I also want you to think about, in addition, is that during this time, as we talked about railroads being heavily regulated, there was really no incentive because of price regulations for railroads to provide better service. So if you think about this, the Pennsylvania Railroad between New York and Chicago was roughly 907 miles. The New York Central was about 960. The Erie was 998.7, 999. Erie Lackawanna could take it 977.8. Why I have those specific numbers, I can't always remember, but as a bona fide, as a highly qualified rail enthusiast, it's my job to do that. And the Baltimore and Ohio somewhere in the middle there. If you are going to move a car over all of those railroads, there will be differences in time, transit time. There will be differences in their yard facilities. There will be a lot of differences, but no matter what, the price is the same. And that should give you an idea of the disincentive that the railroads not only had to provide increasingly better service, but also a disincentive that was given to investors in order to put money into these companies. That's why if you read or you look at them in a historical standpoint, you'll notice that in many ways they had become zombie enterprises, which is to say they were still operating, they were still able to pay their employees, but they were almost dead men walking, and it really didn't matter what was going, what company, whose colors were on the side of the locomotives, whose reporting marks were on the cars. They were very much zombie enterprises, and they were simply operating because they really couldn't do anything else. They couldn't discontinue service. They couldn't do a wholesale selling the business, which is probably what would happen today in time when you have that situation. And that's also why you saw another important part of the preparation for Conrail, which was diversification. Now, diversification was mostly pursued by the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central. They had both been into that substantially as they grew. The best example with the New York Central are the properties that they owned along Park Avenue. Most of Park Avenue in New York was actually developed by the New York Central. One of the good examples is the Commodore Hotel, which of course President Trump ended up purchasing and turning into the Hyatt, which is that glass Hyatt right near Grand Central Terminal. Likewise, you have what is now the Pan Am building, which was built above Grand Central Terminal. And that is another example of the diversification because it's a great way for them to earn money from real estate. And as Stuart Saunders pointed out, in No Way to Run a Railroad, all of Penn Center in Philadelphia was an example of the slow liquidation of the Pennsylvania Railroad when they sold that property and removed what was called the Chinese Wall and closed Broad Street Station, sunk the tracks under to what's now Suburban Station in order to make money off of that, because all of the regulation, the price controls, and the subsidized competition was making it much more difficult for those railroads to get any kind of benefit out of all the investment that had been contributed over the preceding decades to build these systems as we knew them going into World War II. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of what led to Conrail. We will talk a little bit later about some of the other railroads, including number one, the Lehigh Valley, which was sadly another long-term basket case that was inexplicably taken over by the Pennsylvania Railroad as it went into the Penn Central, which again itself was putting together a couple of losing railroads and then taking over the operations of the New Haven, we talked about earlier, had its trouble with the old colony, but its overall system was one gigantic terminal railroad that had short hauls, high costs, high taxes, and several inhospitable governments, both at the state and local level, that were constantly nipping at its heels. The one thing I'll leave you with that I find to be very, very interesting out of all this You've heard the story about the Penn Central. You know they had to take over the New Haven because the Interstate Commerce Commission said that they had to do it in order to have their merger. Well, the Penn Central didn't exactly have a whole heck of a lot of money, not when it started and not when it finished. And one of the things they had to do to take over the New Haven was pay them some kind of a consideration. So what did they do? They gave them Penn Central stock. Now, Penn Central stock was not what you think it was now. It was more than just wallpaper. But as a result, the New Haven estate became the largest single shareholder of the Penn Central. And later on, after Carl Lindner took over the corporate remnant of Penn Central and integrated into his American Financial Group, structurally, it was contained under, again, the corporate remnant of the New Haven. So ultimately, if anybody had thought about this in the 1940s and 1950s and said, hey, the New Haven is going to end up controlling the Pennsylvania and the New York Central, you'd probably say that person was smoking crack, if indeed they actually had crack back then. But in reality, that's exactly what happens, even though by the time it happened, there were no tracks or trains being operated by any of these companies, which is both interesting and sad all at the same time. So what we're going to continue to do is talk about the conditions leading up to Conrail and the creation of Conrail, why that was such a pivotal aspect, or I should say pivotal epoch in the rail industry, and why that might provide some lessons for what the future of our industry will look like as we move into a very different period. So we'll see you later this week. We'll see you down the main line, and stay tuned. We should have some very interesting content for you coming up this weekend. I can't tell you what it's going to be, but I can tell you I'm definitely planning to be out with plenty of film, plenty of lenses, and some shoes that are very, very ready to take on some great rail fanning, even in the cold winter. So, like I said, we'll see you later down the main line, and I hope you have a great evening.